Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Max Claps, the Research Director for IDC's Government Insights practice. Max, you've been watching cloud computing for at least a couple of decades. How would you describe the state of identity and access management capabilities in the federal government?
Hey, Terry, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be back on Federal News Network and talk about a new topic. Yes, you're correct, right? I've been observing and advising on cloud computing since its inception, probably 2006, 2007, when the first definitions from NIST came out. I remember that. And we've come a long way, right? The first few years were about trying and testing, and then FedRAMP came to reassure all of the users that there was a framework to use the appropriate tools and put in place the appropriate guardrails. And now we're at the stage where governments, particularly federal governments, but also state and local and governments globally, are using cloud across their estate for different type of applications, and now even more with AI, which is mostly native to the cloud.
Are you seeing any particular trends as government agencies migrate to the cloud?
Yeah, so there's a few things happening that have matured over the last 2 or 3 years and are really high on the list of priorities for CIOs and CTOs that are using the cloud. I would say one of them is automation in general, because of the new potential capabilities brought by AI and other automation tools, the ability to drive more operation efficiency when doing provisioning, when securing the cloud, when monitoring and observing the performance of cloud environments, which is really helpful for government entities that cannot always afford the latest and greatest competencies. Therefore, automation helps fill some of those gaps and improve the productivity of managing the cloud. We are at a stage where multi-cloud orchestration is a necessity because all governments that we talk to and advise have ended up with an heterogeneous environment, whether they've done it strategically or many times it happened organically. Having the ability to work across those multi-cloud environments and integrate those environments is very important. There's a lot of discussion going on in terms of moving things across different cloud environments, right? So the first few years were all about how do we move from legacy on-premise to public cloud or to government cloud. And now with these heterogeneous environments, there is a new opportunity to optimize and identify for each workload, for each use case, what is the most appropriate cloud environments. So we see things moving from on-premise to private cloud, from private to public, from public being repatriated to private. We have a lot of attention around sovereign cloud environments with different taxonomies and meanings for what sovereign cloud environment is in different regions and different countries. And last but not least, I mentioned it briefly in my introduction, AI, right? AI, Gen AI, and now AI agents are definitely driving consumption of cloud resources and new features and functions that most of the time only exist in cloud environments. They're native to cloud environments. So AI in the cloud is very much the topic of a lot of the conversations that we're having today.
So those are pretty complicated transitions. What are the most common requests for help that agencies make as they try to tackle these challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. They have a number of questions, of course, right? And I want to start not from the technology, but from the organizational aspect, right? I mentioned competencies and skills are very precious and sometimes difficult to get. And now in the current context, the federal government is trying to increase even further the productivity and achieve operation efficiency, reducing the ad count in many agencies. So adapting the operating model, the set of competencies, you build up capacity in the organization to manage and realize the value of the cloud is always a big question, right? And there's no silver bullet. It depends on the size of the organization. It depends on the mission of the organization. It depends on the maturity, how much legacy they have, and so forth and so on. Then, of course, there are some technical questions that have to do with orchestration, with the ability to move from simply lifting and shifting applications and data platforms and workloads from on-premise legacy environment to infrastructure as a service, going all the way to leveraging a fully serverless architecture, right? And it's a long range of options across that spectrum that requires a technical understanding of what is available from each of the vendors. And that is where also the multi-cloud orchestration and integration layer plays a role, where it is important to have sandbox environments to test whether certain capabilities are fit for purpose, right? I was having a conversation not long ago with the Environmental Protection Agency, right? And they've done a lot of work in the cloud. They've, for example, transitioned with help from various vendors such as Microsoft and CGI, their central data exchange to the cloud. And when they started to look at Microsoft capabilities a few years ago, there were some services that were not fit for purpose, but eventually they became fit for purpose, right? So that road mapping, that technical architecture design, and ability to observe the changes over time is really important. Then there's an element, of course, of securing the cloud, right? And there is a lot of work that has been done by CISA in the US and other entities across the globe. FedRAMP is probably the most well-known part of the equation, and it has to do with validating and certifying the ability of vendors and guaranteeing the vendors are meeting all of the requirements, all of the standards, not just in technical terms, but also in terms of the procedures they implement and how they run the environment. But there's more, right? It's about securing, as they say, the cloud posture, right? So how you manage the cloud, how you access resources, how your end users consume resources in the cloud. That's all part of securing the cloud.
Well, you mentioned EPA, and I know it's a case study that you've recently published. Tell us a little bit more about that case and the lessons that they learned that are extendable to other organizations.
Yeah, we've looked at a number of case studies recently. We looked at NASA, for instance, from the perspective of what they've been doing with AWS and SAIC on one of their mission, the PACE mission that is using satellite and new capabilities on their satellites to monitor phytoplankton in ocean. We've looked at EPA and their central data exchange and the work they've done there. We've looked at a UK government department to compare and contrast with the federal government, and we've looked at one other large department and what they've done in terms of multi-cloud. And there's many lessons learned. I would say from an EPA perspective, there's a couple of things. I mentioned one earlier. One of the things that they have learned over time is that to drive benefits from the cloud, including in terms of reducing the cost of operating their environments, taking a close look at their architecture was really important, right? You may have an architectural design to begin with, you may have a target architecture, but that continuously evolve, and identifying opportunities to sunset, for example, capabilities that were living on premise, reducing, therefore, the cost of licensing those capabilities and software components, but also the cost of integrating those on-premise solutions with what you're transitioning to the cloud, really help them achieve those benefits in terms of efficiency. The other piece of that is, and this is surfaced both from EPA and some of the other case studies that we've looked at, is the cloud enables the organization to work in a different way, right? Most of the time, or often, the cloud doesn't necessarily deliver the cost savings right away. That's why there's a lot of attention around FinOps, for example, and we can talk about that later. But definitely the cloud enables more agility and faster time to market. I was talking with some engineers at EPA, some from their system integrator, CGI, and some internally, and they were saying one of the benefits is how they can configure, compose, and then decompose and recompose things, right? In a matter of maybe days or a week, instead of having to wait for months and then testing and finding out that something doesn't work, right? So that the cloud really has that benefit of agility and flexibility that they have owned now into their operating models.
Well, you put a lot of things on the table right there. I'm going to come back to operating models, but I want to go back to cost first, because the point that you made about sunsetting certain systems and bringing others online and the benefits of a cloud migration don't show up right away. How do organizations get a reasonably accurate estimate of the costs and benefits of a cloud migration?
Yeah, so I think there's two elements there again. One is you can implement practical tools, right? You can implement FinOps tools that now have all sorts of indicators. They also have KPIs for green ops, right? So they help the agencies see how much they consume in terms of energy and make their data centers or their cloud environments more sustainable. So the tools are great. There's plenty in the market. Both from software vendors and with some solutions that the system integrators have built on their own or on top of the software vendor tools and the CSP tools. But again, it comes down to the discipline, right? It comes down to, for example, doing an inventory of what you have. Do you have a CMDB that is current, right? You know your configurations, essentially. What you have in your estate. Have you measured the usage of some of those things, right? So one of the exercises that DOGE is incentivizing the departments to do is look at your contracts. What are you using? What are things sitting on a shelf? What are the parts of unexercised contracts? And that is a discipline that should always be there, and it helps at the inception stage when you're embarking on a cloud journey, but then they need to become part of the daily activities to do planning and then to take operational decisions about reducing costs. Very basic things, right? I was talking with somebody in terms of right-sizing your cloud, and they said, I got a call, it was a CIO, I got a call on a Saturday night from a developer, and he was asking about a certain environment that was not working properly. And the answer was that the environment is switched off during the weekend, right? Unless there is an imminent delivery of some important system that needs to go into production. Over the weekend, out of office working hours, certain environments are not absolutely necessary. And simply switching them on and off through a remote control plane helps save costs, right? So it's very down to the basic and the practicalities sometimes.
Well, that seems like a great place for our first break. I've been speaking with Max Claps, the research director for IDC's Government Insights. We'll be back for part two after an industry perspective.